1978, a quiet, soft-spoken man took the helm of a young African nation.
Daniel Arap Moi naapa kwamba nitakuwa mwaminifu kwa Jamhuri ya Kenya.
The world expected him to be a placeholder, a temporary caretaker. Instead, for the next 24 years, Daniel Arap Moi would transform Kenya into a political fortress so impregnable that it earned a chilling nickname, the House of Moi. To his followers, he was the professor of politics, a father figure who brought peace and stability. To his critics, he was a dictator who perfected the art of fear, using detention without trial, ethnic division, and a cult of personality to cling to power. How did a man who started with nothing, a teacher, from the dusty plains of the Rift Valley, become the longest-serving president in Kenya's history? And how did his iron grip finally shatter, leaving behind a legacy so divided that even today, years after his death, the truth remains a battleground? This is the life and times of Daniel Arap Moi, the father, the tyrant, the survivor. Before we dive into the lion's den, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. You don't want to miss the deep dives coming your way. Let's begin. To understand the man, you have to understand the landscape. Daniel Arap Moi was born in 1924 in Sacho Baringo district. It was a harsh, rugged land. His mother, a member of the Tugan sub-tribe of the Kalenjin, raised him in poverty. This early loss instilled in Moi a trait that would define his rule: absolute self-reliance. He learned to read people, to smile while hiding his intentions, and to never show weakness. He trained as a teacher, and for a young African in the 1940s, teaching was power. It was a position of respect. Moi was a strict disciplinarian. Former students remember that he didn't just teach, he commanded. But politics was the real classroom. As Kenya approached independence in the early 1960s, the political landscape was dominated by two giants, Jomo Kenyatta of the Kikuyu and Jaramogi Oginga Odinga of the Luo. Moi, representing the minority Kalenjin communities, felt the fear of marginalization. He needed a patron. He aligned himself with Kenyatta, merging his party, KDU, into Kenyatta's KNU. The deal was simple. Kenyatta would be president, and Moi would be his vice president. For 15 years, Moi was the silent vice president. They called him the quiet man. But make no mistake, he was watching. He saw how Kenyatta used patronage to control the powerful Kikuyu elite. But he also saw how that elite looked down on him. He was a teacher from the Rift, a man they assumed would fade away after Kenyatta's death. They were wrong. When Kenyatta died in 1978, the political establishment tried to rewrite the constitution to prevent Moi from automatically ascending. They saw him as a weak bridge, a transitional figure. But Moi, using a combination of grassroots support and backroom deals, outmaneuvered them all. On August 27, 1978, Daniel Arap Moi was sworn in as the second president of Kenya.
Quietly into the hands of a quiet, unassuming man who had been Kenyatta's longtime vice president and trusted confidant, Daniel Arap Moi.
Mimi, Daniel Arap Moi, naapa kwamba nitakuwa mwaminifu kwa Jamhuri ya Kenya.
With the solemn oath in the national language, Kiswahili, Daniel Arap Moi became the second president of the Republic of Kenya. For all Kenyans, the smooth transition from President Kenyatta to President Moi was a great blessing.
Ewe Mwenyezi Mungu, nisaidie.
The quiet man now held the microphone. At first, Moi's style was a breath of fresh air. He promised to follow in the footsteps of Kenyatta: peace, love, and unity. But it didn't take long for the footprints to veer off the path. The first major crack appeared in 1982. A group of junior Air Force officers attempted to overthrow him.
You are hereby informed that everybody is requested to stay at home. There should be no movement in town. The government has now been taken over by the military until further notice.
It was a violent, chaotic coup attempt that was eventually crushed by loyalist forces. For Moi, this was the defining moment. The quiet man became a paranoid survivor. Moi now saw enemies everywhere, in the military, in the universities, and especially within the Kikuyu community he believed had orchestrated the plot. His response was the creation of a security apparatus so pervasive it invaded every corner of Kenyan life. The General Service Unit, or GSU, became his personal army. And then there was the infamous Nyayo House. If you were a critic, you didn't get a trial. You got a trip to Nyayo House. Hidden beneath the offices of the ruling party were torture chambers, rooms called the maggots and the toilet. Here, political prisoners were held without trial, interrogated and beaten. The goal wasn't just to punish, it was to instill absolute terror. Moi also perfected a political tool that would define his era: ethnic arithmetic. He systematically dismantled the economic power of the Kikuyu. He fired Kikuyu civil servants, revoked their licenses, and replaced them with his own Kalenjin community and other smaller tribes. He created a politics of exclusion, pitting communities against each other to ensure they would never unite to challenge him. But here's the genius of Moi's survival. While he was a tyrant to intellectuals and politicians, to the Wananchi, the common people, he was a grandfather. He traveled the country constantly. He would appear unannounced at villages, dancing with elderly women, handing out shillings. He gave the country the slogan, "We are the footsteps." He was building a cult of personality. His portrait hung in every government office, every school, every shop. The national anthem was played before movies. If you didn't stand for Moi's portrait, you risked being beaten by the youth wingers who acted as his political enforcers. By the late 1980s, Kenya was a one-party state. Moi was the party, and his power was absolute.
Onyesha alama ya KANU nione. Na kutingiza. Kutingiza kila mahali. Kutingiza tu. Tingiza.
But even iron walls crack under pressure. The end of the Cold War changed everything. Western donors, led by the United States, no longer needed Moi as a bulwark against communism. They now demanded one thing: democracy. The cry from multi-party politics grew deafening. Leaders like Kenneth Matiba, Charles Rubia, and Jaramogi Oginga Odinga formed the Forum for the Restoration of Democracy, FORD. They demanded Moi step down or allow elections. Moi's response was brutal. He banned rallies, he detained opponents, and then he unleashed the most controversial weapon in his arsenal: ethnic violence. In the early 1990s, the Rift Valley burned. What started as a political dispute over land rights turned into a systematic campaign of ethnic cleansing. The government, either directly or through proxies, armed Kalenjin warriors to attack Kikuyu, Luo, and Luhia communities living in the Rift Valley. The message was clear: this is Moi's homeland. If you vote for the opposition, you'll be chased away. Thousands were killed. Hundreds of thousands were displaced. It was a masterclass in political manipulation, but at a horrific human cost. The international community was horrified. But Moi, ever the survivor, realized he had to give just enough to keep his job. In 1992, He allowed multi-party elections, but the opposition was divided. Matiba and Odinga couldn't agree on who would lead, splitting the vote. Moi won with a mere 36% of the popular vote. It wasn't a landslide, it was a manipulation of division. He did it again in 1997. Another flawed election, another victory. By the late 90s, Moi was in his 70s, but his grip remained. However, the country was bleeding. Corruption had become so rampant that it had its own name, the Goldenberg scandal. The Goldenberg scandal remains one of the most audacious thefts in African history. In the 1990s, a consortium of businessmen, with the backing of senior government officials, looted over 10% of Kenya's annual GDP through a fictitious gold and diamond export scheme. The government paid out billions of shillings for gold that never existed. Much of that money, critics say, funded Moi's political campaigns and enriched his inner circle. The architect of the scheme went unpunished until after Moi left office. It was a state within a state. By the turn of the millennium, Moi was a political dinosaur. The world had moved on. Kenya's economy was in shambles. And for the first time, there was a constitutional barrier. He could not run again in 2002. His time was up. But if you thought Moi was going to simply ride off into the sunset, you don't know the professor. He had one final trick up his sleeve. He decided to choose his successor. He handpicked a young, wealthy man named Uhuru Kenyatta, the son of his old rival, Jomo Kenyatta. It was a political paradox. Moi, who had spent 24 years crushing the Kikuyu political elite, was now trying to install a Kikuyu as his successor. Why? Because Moi believed in one thing above all else: control. If he could control Uhuru, he could protect himself from prosecution for the crimes of his regime. He could guarantee his retirement. The opposition, however, finally got their act together. They formed the National Rainbow Coalition, NARC, led by Mwai Kibaki. The slogan was simple: Kibaki Tosha. It was Moi versus the united masses. On December 27, 2002, the unthinkable happened. Moi's chosen candidate, Uhuru Kenyatta, was crushed in a landslide. Mwai Kibaki won by a margin so wide that Moi's system of manipulation finally failed. For the first time in 24 years, Daniel Arap Moi was no longer the man in charge. The day Kibaki was sworn in, a nation exhaled. It was a peaceful transition of power, a rarity in Africa. Moi stood in the crowd, no longer the lion, but an old man watching his kingdom slip away. Many expected retribution. They expected him to be arrested for the deaths, the torture, and the looting. But Moi had made a deal. In exchange for a peaceful transition, he was given immunity. He retired to his vast ranch in Kabarak, surrounded by his cattle and his grandchildren. But retirement didn't mean silence. For years, he remained a kingmaker. When the ICC, International Criminal Court, later charged his successor, Uhuru Kenyatta, and William Ruto with crimes against humanity for the 2007 to 2008 post-election violence, Moi played the elder statesman. He brokered peace, using the threat of chaos to ensure his political dynasty. The Kanu boys remained relevant. By the 2010s, Moi was a ghost of the giant he once was. He suffered from strokes and respiratory issues. He was rarely seen in public, but every time he appeared, a hush fell over the country. The old lion was still watching. On February 4th, 2020, at the age of 95, Daniel Arap Moi died. And in his death, the division that defined his life came into sharp, violent focus. For some, it was a day of mourning. They remembered the peace, the stability, the Nyayo days. They remembered a man who spoke their language, who walked their villages, who gave them an identity when the nation was young. For others, it was a day of liberation. They celebrated the death of a dictator. They remembered the bodies piled up at Nyayo House. They remembered the rape, the torture, the families displaced in the Rift Valley. For them, Moi was not a father. He was a feudal lord who stole their future. But the controversy didn't end there. Moi's family requested a state funeral for a man who had famously abolished the post of prime minister, only to create a system that empowered the presidency beyond measure. The debate raged. Should a man accused of looting the treasury receive a hero's send-off? In the end, he was buried at his Kabarak home with full military honors. The flags flew at half-mast. The same security forces that once enforced his will now folded his flag. So, how do we weigh the life of Daniel Arap Moi? He's a cautionary tale of how power corrupts. He took a nation with immense potential and turned it into a patronage machine. He institutionalized corruption, normalized ethnic violence as a political tool, and created a culture of fear that stifled dissent for a generation. But he is also a testament to the complexity of African leadership. He held together a nation of 42 tribes during the height of the Cold War. He oversaw a period where, despite the repression, there was a kind of brutal stability. He understood the psychology of the masses in a way that few intellectuals ever did. The truth is, Moi is not a hero or a villain. He is a mirror. His life reflects the best and worst of Kenya's post-independence struggle. He started as a poor teacher who outlasted giants. He ended as a recluse whose name remains a curse for some and a blessing for others. The Nyayo footsteps have faded, but the path he carved of ethnic politics, of powerful presidencies, of the constant tension between freedom and order, that path is still the one Kenya walks today. What do you think? Was Daniel Arap Moi a nation builder or a dictator? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the life of one of Africa's most controversial leaders, hit that subscribe button. We're telling the stories they didn't teach you in school. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.